Okay, we're good. Yeah, so round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. And I'll be talking to you about work my lab has been doing now for a number of years in using a variety of sensing modalities to understand human social behavior. And so, as you probably know, and you may agree, right, so one of the grand challenges for our times is the challenge of understanding social behavior. And there's lots of reasons why this would be interesting, but the main property is to really move on understanding. And that really means kind of going beyond the surface level of the analysis of communication, beyond the kind of who said what to whom analysis, and really getting at the deeper story. So when you're interacting with someone, why is the interaction happening? What's the context of that interaction? What's the meaning of it for the social partners, and how does it affect their decision making, in the future? And if you think about, for example, movies you watch that are emotionally engaging and scenes from those movies, and I list a few examples here, to understand those scenes and to have the emotional impact the movie has, you need to be able to understand social interactions at this deeper level. So the challenge then is to get at this deeper level of understanding in a computational way. And I believe one of the key methods to approach this, to really solve this problem, is to do all of the sensing from an egocentric. Egocentric means that the sensors are being carried on the bodies of the participants, typically, and the sensors capture the interaction from the participant's point of view. You can think of this as a first-person way of understanding an interaction from the eyes and the ears of the person that's involved. And this is important for a variety of reasons. Some of them are listed here. But the main thing is that this process of communication and engaging socially with another person involves sort of processes at many levels. So there's the process that regulates communication, turn taking, that is a subtle mixture of verbal and nonverbal cues that we use to control who has the floor and who can speak next. And then there's the level of emotional communication, what I understand my partner's emotions to be and how I communicate and share my emotions. And then this notion of much more kind of fuzzily defined intentionality. All of these things are important. All of them are kind of naturally designed to be communicated from the first person perspective, because that's literally how we interact as humans. So if the sensors are aligned with that perspective, then they're capturing the data that's the most fundamental to the interaction. And we've been working in this egocentric space from the computer vision point of view for many years now. We're one of the first groups to really promote this area. And really, we're seeing a kind of an increasing uptake in interest in egocentric perspective, which is very exciting. Now, there's lots of different reasons why you might study these problems, to make a better Alexa, for example. But one of the things that's extremely motivating for our lab is to use this sensing of social behavior and interaction as a means to begin to analyze and understand better developmental conditions like autism. Autism, as you probably know, is a developmental disorder. It affects individuals, creating great barriers in acquiring language, in learning effective patterns of social communication, and it has significant consequences across the lifespan. Even folks that are what we call high-functioning individuals with autism that have high IQs, often above average IQs, will often fail to succeed from a life skills perspective. They'll fail to live independently, will not be able to get a job and hold a job because the deficits around social communication are so strong. And so there's a kind of a global public health challenge right now of identifying individuals with autism and then providing them with effective treatments to improve their outcomes. And what you'll see in this talk, one of the arguments that I'll make is that sensing these social behaviors, particularly nonverbal communication, is a really useful and important problem in getting greater insight into conditions like autism. So what I want to do now is really just take you through a series of sensing problems. Okay, so you can think of this as kind of, in a certain sense, classical AI, that there are these problems we can define and they involve analyzing a variety of sensing modalities. And our job is simply to build highly accurate and effective mechanisms for measuring, for quantifying these social behaviors. And so my goal in this talk is really to persuade you a couple of things. One, as I already mentioned, this egocentric view is super important. It's the right way to look at these phenomena. And then two, we are reaching the point now where we're beginning to have kind of the data sets and the means to really address these problems in a deep way. I think we're on the threshold of being able to build models that are truly understanding social interaction. So the first condition that we targeted in my lab, one of the most basic mechanisms for social communication is eye contact, looking into another person's eyes. And it's known to be of fundamental significance in building social relationships and communicating. It's also known to be impacted in autism. So children with autism will make much less eye contact than their typically developing peers. And it's viewed as one of the things that you assess if you're doing an assessment to see whether a child might have risk for autism. And it's also one of these constructs that's actually quite hard to measure. So if you think about the measurement side of things, if there's a bunch of properties or facets to a condition, and I'd like to understand that condition by simply measuring the important dimensions, then eye contact is one of the dimensions you'd like to understand and measure, and it happens to be quite hard. Okay. And so the question then became one of how could we design a measurement approach, an effective measurement approach for eye contact? And so we landed on the setup that you see here. So this is a very common situation for an assessment. You've got an adult examiner sitting across the table with the child is on their parent's lap, and then the examiner interacts with that child and effectively probes different dimensions of their social skills, their social behavior, eye contact being one of them. And so in this situation, if the examiner is wearing a pair of glasses with a camera right here in the bridge, which is an egocentric sensing approach, then by design of the sensing setup, if the child is looking into my eyes, then they're looking into the camera. And if they're looking somewhere else away from my eyes, they're looking away from the camera. So just by putting the camera in the right place, you can define a very simple pattern recognition problem. Recognize whether the gaze is directed toward the eyes or the gaze is directed somewhere else. And so we collected a large data set in our lab at Georgia Tech and our collaborators' labs as well of children engaged in these social interactions. And then we labeled them by hand, eye contact or not. The green outlined boxes are the positive eye contact examples, and the red outlined boxes are the non-eye contact examples. And this is quite a rich data set of social interactions. And for comparison purposes, on the left are some earlier data sets that also got at different aspects of gaze behavior, but in a much less sort of rich and naturalistic way. So then taking this data set and simply applying sort of basic deep learning methods, standard ResNet type models, we actually got very good performance. And so I'll just show you the way the model performs. So this is a child in our lab at Georgia Tech. This is a typical boy without autism. And green means eye contact is detected, and red means no eye contact. And then you'll see a second, another child. So this is a boy here with autism at our collaborators lab at Weill Cornell in New York. He makes less eye contact in general, but when he makes it, the algorithm is still able to pick it up. That's an example there. So this is now a measurement technology in a way. It's like a microscope for a very specific type of social behavior. And then the question is, how well does it perform? How accurate is it? And so we looked at that question in a paper that came out a few years ago. And so what you're seeing here, so the blue line is the precision recall curve for the algorithm. And then each of the yellow dots is a representation of one of the coders, one of the people that rated or coded the video for eye contact relative to their peers. Okay, so you can think of this as a way to represent in precision recall space the disagreement among the human annotators. Okay, so of course humans are the ultimate source of kind of a gold standard. All of these social constructs that I'm interested in, the gold standard ultimately are humans. And then humans, of course, don't always agree, but if you train raters to reliability in a systematic way that is very standard in psychology and the behavioral sciences, then you can get typically very high levels of agreement among humans, even around relatively complex behaviors. And so what this plot is showing is for each of these yellow dots, it's one of our annotators being compared to the majority vote of their peers. There's 10 annotators in total. They're annotating a completely new held out data set to establish the accuracy of the algorithm. And then the spread of those yellow dots is kind of the disagreement, or what's sometimes called the circle of confusion among the humans. And so what you can see is that the algorithm performance curve passes right to the middle of that spread of the humans. We can pick an operating point like the red diamond there, which is very close to the average agreement among the humans. So effectively what we're claiming is that this algorithm is as accurate as a human in assessing this important dimension of social. And I think this is actually the first example of a nonverbal communication type behavior where we have AI methods that are as good as people in performing the assessment. By the way, would be very happy to have questions or comments during my talk. So if anybody wants to, make a comment or disagree or anything, yes, please.
I guess this is more like detecting whether there is an eye contact, right? But when humans are doing that kind of eye contact, there is more than whether there is.
For sure. So one way to restate what you said is that for humans, eye contact is not something that is intrinsically valuable, let's say, but rather it occurs in the context of something else. So I'm engaging with you and I want to earn your trust and really communicate that I'm listening to you and I'm engaged with you, and I'm going to probably not think about it consciously, but my eye contact is a means by which I will communicate to you that I'm attending and I'm really engaged, right? As opposed to a casual interaction or someone you don't want to interact with, where you're probably not going to make a lot of eye contact deliberately as a way of signaling, please go away. So you're absolutely right that the use of the modality is in a much richer context. And then the ability to measure the modality, as we're describing here, does not yet bring us, to that full context. So there's still, my students can still get their PhDs. There's still work, left to do. Yes. You're maybe asking about whether the children are distracted by the glasses. Yes, yeah, yes. Yeah, that's a great, I can answer that question. A little bit of feedback. Oh, now it's gone. Okay. Yeah, so that's a phenomenon called reactivity, whether the way that you measure a process in psychology affects the process in some way. And so we looked at that. We looked at that specifically in this work with a study design we did with Wendy Stone at UW. And just to give you the details of that a little bit, so we did a design where we basically had an examiner who wore different headwear, so no headwear, conventional glasses like mine, glasses that were bigger, that had a frame that was the size of the wearable glasses you saw, and then the wearable glasses themselves. So there were 4 conditions for the eyewear, if you will. And then we had a protocol where we basically would, engage with kids and then gave them a little task. So there was these little goldfish crackers, and kids love them. So we'd put the goldfish cracker at different parts of the body, and then when we're done, we give it to the child, they can eat it. And so we did this a number of times. So the kids would follow the goldfish because they know that they're going to get it, when you're done. And then we asked the question both, and then we coded the videos manually to see where the gaze was directed. And we asked the question, is there any difference in the gaze behavior across the headwear conditions? So did the variation in the headwear affect in any way the child's gaze behavior? And in that study design, there was no effect. So we sort of conclude from that there's no reactivity in this particular setting. It included that condition. Yeah. But one thing to keep in mind is that these are scenarios where you're not interacting with someone that you know very well. So in an assessment setting, the child would be brought into an examiner that's not part of their family. So this would be a person, they don't really know them. They don't necessarily have an expectation around what they look like. So as long as they're not wearing something super bizarre, it's probably not going to really capture the child's attention. So there's reasons sort of more theoretically to think that it's probably not going to have a big impact. That plus habituation would be 2 arguments why it's probably fine. Let me go on, and if there's more concerns about reactivity, I can come back to it, at the end. Yes.
I was young, then I had
Yes. 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 Yeah. That's right. Correct. Yeah. And so you're making a really good point about the fact that there are variations in social skill and the utilization of social communication modalities in both the typical population and populations that may have a diagnosed condition, right? And there are people that are very somehow charismatic and engaging, and there are people that are shy and much less engaging. And those are just, words we use to describe variations in the use of these social communication behaviors. So when you talk about children with a diagnosis, then you're talking about a condition that's defined to some degree for which there are treatments. And so then the measurement of those constructs actually takes place in the context of a treatment or other type of medical, let's say medical decision making. So then you can make that pretty precise because you're really trying to address a specific condition. Otherwise, as you say, like there's just variability in the population, and you're going to see variability in how the phenomenon emerges. But there is a pretty consistent finding that kids with autism make much less eye contact, and it is believed to be kind of part and parcel of the broader social deficit within autism. So there's sort of good scientific evidence why you would want to measure this specifically, and why you would like to increase, for example, the frequency of eye contact in young kids that have a diagnosis. But it's a poorly understood condition. So there's definitely, like, for example, we don't know whether the ultimate, the symptomatology that defines autism and the outcomes, are they a consequence of those social deficits, or are the social deficits simply a side effect of having autism that is unrelated to the core condition? So that's not actually known at all. So there's a great deal of uncertainty right now around complex sort of mental health conditions like autism. This was great. I'm so glad. As soon as I mentioned the word question, I got a bunch. And so I'm very happy. Thank you. I'm going to move ahead and then I'll pause again. We can do some more, but of course, also jump in at any time. All right. So now I want to talk about another gaze-related construct, because there's more to social attention than just eye contact. And so we'd like to be able to get at more broadly, understanding where people are attending in a variety of scenes. And so here's the problem. You've got some video footage containing many people, and then you'd like to simply know where everybody is looking. Okay, so in the top row, the woman whose head is inside the green box, we're predicting in every frame where she's likely to be attending in the video, including the cases where we can't actually see where she's attending because the target is outside the video frame. So the second and third images, we can't tell where she's attending in that setting. And then likewise, we do the same analysis for the man in the second row. And so this is another sort of well-defined measurement problem to try to measure where people are attending, likely to be attending. The evidence for this comes from human raters, once again. So humans look at these videos, they make an inference about where gaze is likely to be. And then there's some disagreement among those humans. We capture that as a heat map. And then we design an algorithm that's trained on those heat maps and attempts to predict those heat maps on unseen footage. So we collected a data set for this task. So this is the first data set, the first video data set for this problem. We released it a few years ago. And it contains painstakingly annotated every face in every frame for a decent number of video clips, mostly collected from YouTube. And you can see a few statistics of that data set in the slide here. I'll just briefly show you the architecture that we published, which at that time, this was 2 years ago, was our best architecture for this problem. The details are not maybe super important, but just to highlight a few things. So there's really two parts to this problem. So there's the challenge of figuring out in the frame of the video where the attention targets might be. You can think of this as a saliency question. What are the things that a person might want to look at? So obviously, other people, objects, animals are all plausible gaze targets. A blank wall, probably is. So then there's a branch of this algorithm, the top branch of this deep model, that's really trying to determine sort of where people are likely to look. And then the bottom branch is looking at the region of the head for the target individual, and then trying to do the same thing people do, deduce from head orientation, possibly aspects of how the eyes are configured and other aspects of the head and the body, trying to deduce where you're likely to be looking. And so then the architecture brings these two branches together and fuses them to produce the final predicted heat map, which is the kind of the distribution of attention for the target individual. And so this is an architectural design that's actually quite old. It goes back to the first piece of work on this from MIT around 2017 or so. And what we've learned in our work is that the key to making this work well is to fuse these streams as early as possible. If you look at the history of these architectures, the first architecture was kind of a late fusion kind of approach, and then people began to move that earlier and earlier. And that seems to be the key to making this work well. And I'll have more to say about that architectural side in a little bit. So let me just maybe show you the performance. So this is the performance of our algorithm at the time we published the paper. We had the best results. And this is just some example video clips here, you can kind of see what the different types of situations are in the data set. The top set of methods are some prior methods we were competing against. And then in the middle, you see some ablation studies.
This one is equal to side D. You just pull one from that table. That is simple. These are the ones that are.
I think somebody on the Zoom is unmuted, so maybe you want to mute.
Okay, so this was, I mean, this was computed.
Hello? Folks on Zoom, could you mute yourselves? Awesome, thank you. So then we did the same study as before of taking some humans that were doing rating for us and then giving them a held out set of video clips and asking them to separately rate a larger number of raters the videos and then look at their agreement. And the humans are much more in agreement than the algorithm is with humans. So we're behind the gap right now of human level accuracy by about 21 something, 0.13 or so, 5 or so. We'll get there eventually. We're not there yet. So this is, I think, promising, but not yet ready to be used directly as a tool. Let me just show you the performance, just as an example. So the green dot is the detector, is the inferred base target of the person, the target person. That's a mistake right there. Right. So work to be done, but promising, I would say. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Thank you. That was my intention. Yes. Correct. Yeah, so I mean, so the question was, there was one mistake in the video, and why did that mistake occur, and could we correct it? There are limits to human mobility here. So if you are sufficiently far away from someone, or in a context where it's really hard to know what could be happening, humans are also not great at predicting where people are looking. So I think that particular failure case, we can get it because the resolution was pretty high. So we could see the eyes move. I think the algorithm may have not had enough examples where the head was still and the eyes were moving to be able to figure that out. Another thing is that this model is actually not a temporal model, really. I mean, there's the temporal component, but it's quite weak. We're working right now on another version of this model that's much more a video model. So that may be enough to actually, cross the threshold there. But I think that particular example is doable. But you can easily generate examples where you're right at the edge of human performance and it's very hard. And will AI get there? With a large enough data set, the answer is probably yes, but it may take some time. All right, so let's talk now about autism, since we motivated our talk that way. I want to come back there. So I just want to briefly illustrate how these tools might be used to understand autism in a different way. So one of the main issues with autism is the heterogeneity, which means that individual people with autism vary quite a bit across many of the different criteria. One area where there's a lot of variation and is a lot of clinical significance is with respect to acquiring language. So what this plot shows, each of these trajectories is a single child with autism. These are all kids with autism. And the x-axis is the child's age in years, so their chronological age by birthdays. And then y-axis is their language age. So then in a typical child, which is how this coordinate system is set up, you have the orange line where the language age and the age in years just proceeds in lockstep. And what you can see is that for the most part, the kids with autism are depressed, below that curve. So they're acquiring language, they have less language, and they're acquiring it at a slower rate than a typically developing child. But you can see the heterogeneity, right? So there are kids that are actually acquiring language, these kids, for example, at a rate which in some places seems to exceed that typical children. And there are other children that are almost getting no language at all. That's a really significant and serious concern. And so the research community framed the question, if you're assessing these children at intake, at the first time you see them, is there anything you can measure that could give you insight as to which curve they're going to be on? Which are the kids that are going to be on these curves versus these curves? people tried all the obvious things like IQ and so on, SES and so on. None of those were predictive. And the thing that turned out to be predictive was actually the child's nonverbal communication skills. The children that can communicate nonverbally that when they're, very young actually, but let's say 12 months, they're already communicating nonverbally in many cases quite effectively, 18 months very effectively. And kids at those ages have very few words, sometimes no words. And so what we learned through the study of this phenomenon in psychology was that these nonverbal skills are effectively scaffolding in some poorly understood way the acquisition of language. And if you could then assess those nonverbal skills, you'd have the means to potentially identify what kids are going to do. And this was kind of studied in a number of ways, and I'll kind of connect that back to where we're going. Yes, you had a question. So basically, there's several ways to do it, but the most basic measure is simply to assess how many words a child either understands or produces. And this can be done in the clinic with a trained examiner, and you can also ask parents. So there's a lot of different measures you can use to get at sort of what level of language a child has. So let's just look at what this nonverbal communication looks like. So there's a phenomenon which is called joint attention, which involves interacting with a social partner around some objects or a shared situation. I just want to play this video for you. This is an expert communicator, this 15-month-old girl.
See? And the doggy is saying hi to the bear. Okay. That's it? No more? No more? Looky.
So, she has the words, at least in this example, but if you look at what she's doing kind of frame by frame, she has complete mastery of the situation. She's manipulating her world, directing her social partner's attention, checking in with them. Do you see what I'm doing? And she's going to pretend to close the book. Just right now, she'll check back and see what was the effect of that. What do you say about that? Check in again. No, let's open the book again. So she's just, complete mastery of her world with no words. Okay. And so in general, what you find is that children that can do that to some degree, even if they have autism, they have much better language. So the children that are performing the top curve are the ones that have a high score, particularly good attention skills called responsive attention. And the children that are on the lower curve have a suppressed ability to produce that skill at a young age. So this motivated several developments in psychology. It motivated the development of instruments to study the phenomenon. That's where this data came from, with an instrument called the ESCS that's used to elicit an assessment of joint attention. And then it also led to various intervention programs that focus on joint attention as a construct that you might try to teach to children when they're young that could then lead to gains in language and socialization later in life. The main point here is the fact that this phenomenon measured at intake has predictive value over 4 years. Okay, so for kids that are young, 4 years is an eternity of time. And to have a stable finding like that is pretty remarkable. So it just speaks to the importance of this construct to look at. So then just to complete the story, we did a little bit of a small experiment 2 years ago to use this basic measure of attention that we developed. And then on top of this attention pattern, we simply built a small classifier to try to predict the coding of these joint attention skills in these videos. And this setting that we're in is the same setting as the ESCS. We can use the ESCS codes that Peter Mundy developed to quantify our ability to measure these joint attention skills. And so this classifier is not very accurate. It's like 0.7. And again, the human clinicians who are trained are easily get to 0.9 kind of effective agreement on this task. So there's a gap there to be closed, but we'll get there. And of course, this phenomenon requires more than just gaze. It requires gesture, other things that we're not measuring yet. So there's plenty of things to do to improve the performance with this construct. So all you can really say, I think, is kind of a predictive, or correlational finding, which is the kids that score well on an instrument that is designed to measure this particular skill. And the instrument is designed with a kind of theoretical model of communication plus empirical observation behind it. So you can think of this as kind of the state of the art in the community that studies nonverbal behavior. It's the state of the art way to measure this phenomenon. Kids that score well on that measure have better language outcomes 4 years later. That's the finding that the data really supports. Anything sort of beyond that about causal mechanisms or anything else is really speculation. So this is Michael Siller's PhD work, and I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was a pretty well-powered study. So it was probably, I would say, 60 to 70 kids, would be my guess, which in autism studies is pretty good. Well, so it's called joint attention because so there may be a longer story there that I don't know, but it's a phenomenon related to attention, but it's not just about your attention. It's about your attention as it relates to your social partner. And there's a misconception that is sometimes out there in the computer science world that it means looking at the same object at the same time. And that's actually not true. So it doesn't mean that your gaze is tightly coupled with another person's gaze. It simply means that via your gaze, you're interacting around an object of some kind. So in these protocols, there's some toy like the one you see here. I'll play the video for you. And then the child is looking at the toy. She's checking in with the examiner. She's also using her face and her hands as well. And it's that construct of interaction around the object that is really the phenomenon of joint attention. Okay. So we've been talking about children, and we've been talking about fairly granular, let's say, building blocks of social communication. So gaze shifts, joint attention. These are phenomena that emerge in really young kids with the language and very little social experience as we would think of it as adults. And part of the research program should be to get to more complex concepts. To do that, of course, we always start with the need for data. We've been involved the past few years in a large data set collection effort, generously funded by our colleagues at Facebook, led by Kristen Grauman. And it resulted this year in a data set that we released for the first time called Ego4D. And the way to think about Ego4D is that it is a very big and very complicated egocentric video data set. So more than 3,000 hours collected all around the world, actually, with a wide range of different tasks that are being performed. And then within that large team, there was a small team you see here that were the folks that really wanted to do social interaction. And so we spent our Ego4D token, if you will, on social behavior. Okay. And that also ended up being quite diverse. So the different sites collected very different types of social data in different settings. But this is already, I think, the largest data set that combines, video and audio of naturalistic social interactions that's out there, has ever been collected. And it has some other firsts that I'll get to as well. So the point is, this is out there, it's available, you can download it freely and work on it. And it's a pretty exciting data set to begin to look at. So this is the social part of Ego4D, and you can see the statistics on the right there as far as the N, the number of hours, and so on. And there's one international site, but otherwise it's in the US. So it's not as international as all of Ego4D. That's something that we're actually work on in the coming years. We're going to do another collection that's explicitly trying to get a more diverse set of participants. But one of the key driving factors, two key driving factors, we wanted to do naturalistic interactions in natural settings like homes and other places like that, and then multimodal. Okay. And so I want to pivot now and talk about what we actually did at Georgia Tech. This is a much smaller subset of the data set, but it has very rich both behaviors and sensing modalities. And so we did our collection in the bottom category here. You look mostly at what are called games here. If you're not familiar with those games, there's a game called Mafia you might have played. It's also the same type of game. So you can think of these as basically theory of mind games. Okay, so the point of the game is that your opponents, the other social partners that you're playing the game with, you want them to believe something is true about the state of the game. If it's the werewolf game, you want them to believe that you're not the werewolf, if you actually are the werewolf, and that somebody else is. And then you just interact, you talk, and you deceive, and so on to try to persuade. And then at the end of that process of discussion, there's a voting phase where people have to, put their money where their mouth is. They have to say what they think is true about the world. So this is a nice little model, I think, for theory of mind in settings that are socially very complicated. But then at the end, there's an objective outcome. So you can predict what people are going to do, how they're going to vote. And if you can predict how people vote accurately, then you've probably learned something about the state of their belief. And that's the idea. So there's no publications yet on this task, but we're going to have one hopefully submitted this year. I think it's a very interesting place to study constructs like theory of mind that you're probably all familiar with that are at a much higher level than even joint attention, because theory of mind requires you to have some developmentally more complex constructs. Like, I understand that other people see the world differently from me. I understand by looking at you what percepts you're receiving in forming your beliefs about the world, or at least I can try to infer what you're receiving. And then I infer ultimately what you believe, your belief states. And I have my own belief states, and then I infer what you think my belief states are. So there's this very complex, almost circular deduction chain that arises in these situations. On the sensing side, it's quite rich. We have video, we have a binaural audio, so you can localize the sound sources in the environment. We actually have wearables on both wrists as well. And then in these setups with 4 or 5 people, one of them is also wearing an eye tracker. We have high quality eye movement measurements for one of the participants. So this is probably the richest naturalistic social data set that there is right now. And I encourage you to take a look at it. You can look at it right now. The way we did it is we went to people's homes, brought all the hardware, consented them all to do the thing, sat there outside their home in our cars while they played all these games in the rain. Sometimes they called the police on us, the neighbors did. And it's actually true. Then when they were done, collected all the hardware back, compensated them. So it was very laborious. My students were so happy when Ego 4D was released, except then I reminded them that we didn't get to our N yet. So we actually have a lot more data collection still to do. Yes. Yes. Well, no, we didn't go door to door like a salesman. We recruited them over social media and various channels, and then consented them in advance. And then when they were all organized, we went there at a prearranged time for them to play the games. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, we got a lot of rejections. This was a very painful data collection process. So there's a couple of tasks that are currently part of the Ego 4D benchmark task suite. And the first results from this set of tasks will be published at ECCD, which is a vision conference, in about 2 weeks. And so they're very simple. They're just looking at me, which is an eye contact kind of task, and then a little bit more sophisticated, talking to me. So are you talking to the ego person, the first person, or not? And there's some baselines for this, and there'll be some new algorithms that will come out at ECCD on these tasks. But there's a long set of tasks that go beyond this that we intend to work on with this data set. So just to give you a sense of what the data looks like, this is one of our groups.
That's why I was thinking so hard. I was like,
The videos are all synchronized as well as with the audio. People are eating, drinking, smoking while they play the game and chat. And annotated fairly thoroughly, at least a subset of the data. Eventually it'll all be annotated really thoroughly. So check it out if you're interested in this type of data. Eye tracking glasses, yes. Oh, they're all wearing a video recorder. So they're all wearing either the eye tracker or this Ordro, which is a side-mounted video recorder. They're all wearing a video recorder. It just varies whether it's an eye tracker or not. It is getting PPG, yeah. So you can get, like, for example, heart rate variability from this data. We haven't actually extracted that yet. A lot of this stuff we collected it and haven't yet fully processed it. But we do intend to release heart rate variability data for each participant. We have their motion as well. Look at drinking.
You would have it's brilliant. That's not how we what I'm.
Yeah, so you're asking a great question, which is, there's tremendous amount of excitement on multimodality, and then sometimes the excitement sort of dies a death in the data, because you want to show it really true, and then sometimes you can't. I've been there too, so I know exactly what you mean. All I can say is that there's a work we're doing right now that's not published yet, where we're looking at trying to categorize the persuasion strategies that are being used in these videos by the participants. And the model that's doing that is using, obviously, the language. We have a transcript of all the audio that's been transcribed and then checked for errors. And then we have a model that also uses the video. And so the combined model in the results I saw on Thursday from my students is doing a little bit better than the NLP model. That may be one data point, but of course it's unpublished and it could change, if we find out there was a mistake or something. So yeah, but I know what you mean. It's never easy. Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so one of the key things for us was that they had to be. So I would say the key thing is that they need to know each other. Okay, because if you're with people that you know, then you are capable of your most rich kind of expressive behaviors in a certain sense. And if you're with strangers, you're simply not. And most of the data that's been collected for these kind of things is actually stranger data. So people recruit students to the lab that never met each other and they play some game together and you look at, emerging leadership or one of those kinds of things. But I think those are, obviously they're interesting questions to ask in those settings, but I think the real grist for the mill is people that are familiar, so that they really let it hang out, and so all these folks are friends, and we actually have a characterization of their social relationships at least a simple level. We know whether they're married or whether they're cohabitating or whether they're boyfriend, girlfriend, whether they're, friends, whether they're relatives. We did some demographics and other instruments to get at that information. We also have personality tests.
That's why I was thinking so hard. I was like,
Yeah, maybe. Okay, so I want to now pivot a little bit. I've been talking about social behavior, which is obviously very important, but as we've already seen in this example, social behavior occurs in a context where you're doing other things. People are complex, right? We don't just talk. We talk and we eat at the same time, and we do other things, at the same time. And so we really want to ultimately get at the complete gamut, because they may be very important. Like it may be that you need to understand what I'm doing besides communicating to put my communication in the appropriate context. So that simply means more egocentric vision tests, okay? Sensing other things besides my social interaction. And so one of the basic things we'd like to measure in this setting is the attention of the camera wearer, okay, which is different in a subtle way from all the things I showed you previously. Previous results were about either is someone looking at me, or when I look at a scene, can I tell where people are looking, that I'm looking at them, right? So they're second person compared to me. Now we're talking about, I'm not wearing an eye tracker, I'm just wearing a camera, and I'd like to know where I'm looking. Okay, so that's a very hard problem. In a certain general sense, you can argue that it's probably insolvable. But in kind of real life context where gaze is utilized in a meaningful way, it actually is solvable. And the debate is about how accurate it can ultimately be, which we're kind of working out as we work on these problems. So we were the first to look at this problem many years ago with my student Alireza Fati and Yin Li. And I just want to show you that model because it's a nice example. So this is a data set we collected at Georgia Tech and a special lab we had that was a home where you could cook meals and things. And so in this example, the person is wearing a pair of eye tracking glasses. So we have the measurement of their eye movements as well as we have the video. And then we built a model that just used the video, and the model was trained to predict the gaze point, right? So where the gaze is directed based on the eye tracker. So you can see the result here. So the green dot is the eye tracker. We're not using that as data in the model. The model just uses the pixels in the video and nothing else. And then it tries to predict where the eye tracking result is. And that little colorful Gaussian lab thing is the algorithm's prediction. So this model was built in the days before deep learning was really a thing. And it used a lot of hand design features based on an understanding from the psychology literature on how gaze is coordinated with hands, for example, in solving various tasks. And you can see that in this example, the task was kind of a hand-eye coordination task. Those are tasks where you can imagine you could say something about the gaze if you knew what was happening in the scene. Okay, and so we actually had pretty decent predictive performance with this early model, way better than I thought was possible, and that was a little more than a little bit surprising. And we've been working on this problem since then a bit more, and I just want to show you the latest model that's going to appear at a conference later this year. So this is now simply tackling that same problem, again, using all the modern tools of deep learning, et cetera, and then also using the Ego4D data set now, in addition to the older data sets we collected in the past. And so this is an architectural diagram, but I don't think it's super important for me to cover the details of this. You can read the paper for that. But just to point out, this is a transformer style architecture. And then if you're familiar with those architectures for video or for images, what you know is that they tessellate the image into chunks and then model the relationships between them with a deep trainable feature representation. And what we discovered in this work was that having a kind of a separate token for the global context turned out to be valuable. So this was a comparison between an architecture that has a global context token against an otherwise standard vision transformer that doesn't. And we showed that in this particular task, that global token is quite valuable and architecturally useful. So that's kind of the machine learning finding for this particular task. But let me show you the performance. So this is now a modern version of this older result. This is the same data set on the top that you saw before. I'll just get all this display, this different tasks. Always you're predicting the green dot is, which is the gaze measurement. And this is the result for Ego 4D using the participant who was wearing the eye tracker as the source of data. So the nice takeaway is that the Ego 4D settings are much more varied than ones we collected almost more than 10 years ago, because they involve interaction with objects, but also interaction with people. This model was not trained differently for different situations. It was simply trained on all the data. So that's kind of interesting. I think we'll to see that approach holds when the data sets become much bigger and more diverse in terms of the settings of the context. But I think it's a promising finding. And then this is just the performance of that model I just showed you against the other state-of-the-art models. And you can see the F1 score is pretty low. So this is a hard problem, particularly if you look at Ego 4D, actually quite hard. So there's plenty of room to improve. And we probably need a lot more eye tracking data for this to become really highly accurate is my feeling. So we're working on increasing that as well. Yeah.
But I think from that point of view, I just want to my attention could be like scenarios and trade-offs. So I think that's more.
Correct. So the question was, how does the model handle uncertainty? And the short answer is it handles it just like every other deep model, which is to say not at all. So it doesn't really know that you need uncertainty. It's actually being trained to not have uncertainty. And then in the end, if you look at the activation pattern, there is some distribution there, but it's certainly not the distribution that exists in the raters, because the raters in the version of this where there's raters, you actually get uncertainty. In the version of this that you saw in this paper, this problem, it's just the eye tracker. There's actually no uncertainty. Whereas I think, when you deploy eye trackers in naturalistic settings, it's actually wrong to think that there's no uncertainty, even in the eye tracker. Never mind in the algorithm that's trying to make this much more, noisy prediction because it has no information about what the eyes are doing because you can't see them, right? So this is just, this is a point in time. So I think the right thing to do would be to re-annotate these videos with humans who are trying to infer what the algorithm is trying to infer. So then that's a kind of a gold standard for the task of looking at the pixels and determining where people are looking. Okay, so then you'd get, if you did that, we plan to do that, we just haven't done it yet. If you do that, then you'll get a proper heat map. It'll be complex, because humans will disagree. I think you're looking there. I think you're looking there. And that's a much better starting point then for modeling uncertainty. And then you would need to use deep learning tools that are actually trying to model the uncertainty, which we haven't done. And all of this is very doable at some level. Although I do think that handling uncertainty is intrinsically harder than what we've been doing to date. It's the main problem is that it's video. So it's just, it's a very complicated modality of data to model, and to get it working with a deep model at all and get good performance is sort of not easy. So then you have to do uncertainty on top of that. It becomes very hard. So we just have to do more work. I think it's in the realm of the doable, but it's definitely non-trivial.
Is it going a lot more than getting a stability map from the thing, or what is this adding to the stability map? Because you have no idea what the eye is looking.
Well, so the way to think about it is really in terms of the losses at the end of the day. So this model is trained to predict where the gaze target actually is, using the entire image as the set of features to make that prediction. And so then it's doing its best job on that. And if we had just had the data set from before in our kitchen, what's called the Aware Home at Georgia Tech, I would have been super skeptical because I'm sure a deep model can overfit to that wear home kitchen pretty well and probably doesn't generalize to anything else at all. And then once we had Ego 4D, I was ready to work on this problem again, because then you can put both of those data sets together and they're very different. So the domain gap from Ego 4D to the kitchen is quite large. And so then we have a setting where we can actually test in a proper way generalization. So all you can really say is the model is doing its best to solve the task with the data that it has. And then the F1 score of 0.448 means that it's not yet working super well. I mean, I don't know what else to say, you know.
And then feature level, what exactly is it?
I see. So you're saying what information is being used? Yeah, I don't have a great answer to that yet. So we did a little bit of investigation, but this is all pretty new, this model. So we just got it this year and we're still kind of looking into it. So, you know, the older model, because it wasn't involving deep learning, we knew exactly what information was being used because we designed it ourselves, right? But now we're using tools that are more powerful, but harder to understand, you know, what they're getting at. So I don't really have a great answer to your question. Certainly nothing I can show you to answer your question, but it's a good question. We are looking at it. We just haven't quite gotten. Well, so the problem is you need to know what the gold standard answer is. Like you need to know where the person is looking somehow. So the GoPro doesn't have an eye tracker, so you just have the video, but you don't know where anybody was looking. But I do think it would be a very interesting thing, and I don't think anybody has done it actually, to simply take those videos and do the same experiment. Ask people, where is the person looking? Now, the problem is if it's on your chest, it's really hard to say, because if it's on my chest, which is the common way, which is a way to mount, or if it's on my surfboard, right, then there's almost no relationship between my body movement and the camera movement. The best case is on your head. On your head, then whenever you turn your head, you know, the video is responsive. So then as a human, you have a chance to know, like, oh yeah, the camera is like here, and then I move to there, and you're doing something, and this thing is there. So almost certainly you're looking at that thing. Like you can make those deductions as a human when you have all that context. So the best case would be head-worn cameras. And if you can find those on YouTube, and there's a ton of them, then you could do this annotation thing I described. You'd get a nice, you know, heat map of different humans' opinions about where the person is looking. That would be a great data set. So we haven't done that because I just haven't had time to organize it. But if somebody did that, that would probably be a paper that people would, you know, use that data a lot. So you could get a lot of citations. So anyway, just an idea. I'd love for somebody else to do that. Okay, but if they don't, we'll do it eventually. All right, so I want to now just talk about one more thing. So I'm just kind of going to go down a list here because really, I mean, the program here, as you probably figured out by now, the program is pretty simple. Okay? Just list all the things that matter and then build models for all of them and make them work as good as people do. That's what we've just been doing that, you know, for quite a while. So we're just going to keep doing it until we do them all. At that point, you know, we'll know what's going on. So what else would you like to do? So there's a bunch of work on hands, finding hands, detecting them. I wouldn't say that's a solved problem, but it's actually pretty good. So we've been working instead on another problem, which is predicting where the hands are going to go. Because one of the properties of all the things I just showed you so far is that they're properties in the moment. I'm telling you, in the moment, where you're looking. In the moment, where is that person looking? In the moment, you know, what are you doing? And as you can imagine, like for humans, we're doing way more than that. Okay, so we know what's happening in the moment. We also have lots of ideas, often pretty good ideas, of what's going to happen next. What's the next thing that my social partner is going to do? And we know from a lot of literature that that's actually really important, because in order to participate, you have to anticipate. Otherwise, the loop is too slow, right? And you can't actually work effectively. So we're all the time anticipating what's going to happen. And I'm forming my words in anticipation that I'm going to get the floor. And then I kind of already know what you're probably talking about. And I'm thinking how I'm going to respond to that. And all that's a predictive loop at some level. So we need to build models that are capable of prediction. And so prediction is super hard, of course, much harder than detection. So we tried something which is maybe the easiest thing, although it didn't turn out to be easy at all, which was predicting where the hands are going to go in these settings where there's pretty structured activity. So there's a chance you could solve it. So here's the definition of the problem. It's part of the Ego 4D benchmark suite. My student Wenxu Jia produced that, did this problem for Ego 4D, and we have a paper that'll appear in 2 weeks at ECCV, which is the current state of the art for this task. And the idea is you get a window of video you get to look at and analyze, And then there are 3 time points, you delta 1, 2, 3, and then you predict what the hand's mass are going to be at those future points in time. So you're predicting where the hands are going to be. And the key is it needs to be the hand mass, because otherwise it's an undefined point on the hand. It's not at all clear, like even if you get it right, you actually know what's going on, etc. So the mask, I think, is key. Then you really have to put your money where your mouth is. You know, this is where the hand and the fingers and everything are. Okay, so that's the job. So it's super hard. This slide says that it's super hard. And then one of the things you want to do is predict head motion, because the head motion drives what the hands are doing. So the model is actually using the hand to synthesize the distribution of possible future head motions, and then feeding that predicted distribution in with the visual features from the video to then make the predictions about the hand masks. There's a lot of detail here that I won't talk about this in the paper, and I'm going to skip the slide on the losses. You've probably seen plenty of those slides already. And then this is just some numbers showing that we're doing better than some baselines. Not a lot better, I would say, but better enough to get a paper, I guess. And I think there's a lot of room to improve this. So this is our first effort, and I think there's a lot more that one can do. Let me just show you the results. So these are some good examples where it works pretty well. Whenever it turns red, we're forecasting. That means we're predicting in the future where the hands are going to go. And in the early stages, it's not that hard. You just say, well, they don't move very much and you're pretty good. But then later on, if they move a lot, so you get those right, it's not trivial. This is an example where it's pretty good, I would say. Not easy. Okay, and then here's some examples where it doesn't work quite so well. You'll see more error, particularly in the future. So some big errors, actually. But anyway, this is a super hard problem. I don't mind showing you the mistakes. When should I actually end this talk? In 10 minutes. But that at least time for questions or no questions? Yeah, I can end sooner than that. Then there'll be more time for questions. Sorry, I should have had this in my mind. I was actually timing it. Then I realized I don't know what the target is. So the timer is not very helpful if you don't know what you're aiming for. All right, yeah, this will be no problem. So I want to just talk about maybe one more thing and then I'll wrap up, okay? So if you think about this from the perspective, we started kind of with the eyes, we kind of moved out, right? And so the last step is to move into the scene. We've been on the body up to now. Everything has been about your body or other people's interactions with your body in a certain sense. And I want to end by moving out into the world. So it's clear that all these things we're talking about, you know, human activities, social interactions, they all take place in a 3D context. And the 3D context is super important. You know, it affects how you organize yourself in space. It affects what you're likely to attend to, because if you're facing a certain direction, all you can see easily are the things in that direction. You want to see the other stuff, you've got to turn around, right? So the orientation in space and then the configuration of the space, they play a big role in how you interact with both your social partners and the scene. And for the most part in vision, you know, until recently, we haven't really been able to bring that 3D context into the picture very much, because we just didn't have any way to get at it, you know. And especially in the egocentric world, that's true. So this is actually the first paper that'll appear again at ECCV, and a data set that's associated with it that really combines a very sort of dense model of the 3D world along with the egocentric video, and then the ability to predict what people are doing. And so this is the most zeroth order use of 3D information, I would say, which is to understand how your location in the environment affects what you're doing. And then by exploiting that 3D information, if you have it, you should be able to improve the accuracy predicting what's happening. So this is an activity recognition problem that uses the 3D data set as one of the sources of information to solve the problem. And this is a joint work with some folks at FAIR and Reality Labs Research. And this is my student, Mia Lou's PhD work. So the basic idea is very simple. We have access to the environment because we did a Matterport scan of this setup at Meta, where people were performing activities wearing wearable cameras in different parts of this kind of made up indoor environment. It looks like a house, basically, except it wasn't anybody's real house. And then there's some map here I'll go on that. But the main thing is to figure out how to exploit the scene context. So you have the 3D scan, and what should you do about it? And so the idea was to essentially annotate the objects. So you can do that. You can label things that are in the 3D scan. But then how should you bring that information into the model? That's the real question. How should you represent the 3D scene and bring it into the model? And the idea there was to do the most simple thing, which is to build a kind of a voxelized representation of the scene and then organize the labels with respect to that voxelized representation. So this is a hierarchical model. So there are large voxels that are the coarse level of analysis. And then there are subdivided into child voxels that contain more fine-grained analysis. In every case, what you're analyzing is just the distribution of labels for the surfaces in the scene that have been labeled by humans. Okay, so you can think of this as like a nice little, coarse feature that tells you, here's a place where there's a sofa and there's some pillows. And then if you go over here, there's a sofa and there's a table and so on. So you're getting some, properties of the environment organized in this voxelized way. Now, to use this in a model, you need to register the egocentric video with this environment. And that's a non-trivial problem. It is a well-studied problem. It's called visual localization or visual odometry. You're just trying to figure out where is the camera based on the vision. And so we have a solution for that, which is a standard method, but it's not super great. So this is showing you the video, and then it's showing you in the map where the person is estimated to be based on this visual odometry, and it's pretty noisy. So this was not as good as it probably could be, but it's good enough to do something useful. Right. And so then there's an architecture which combines in a two-stream fashion features derived from the video and features that are derived from this 3D representation of the scene, and they're fused together to produce the final output, which is recognizing what the activity is that's being performed. And so this is a data set that's part of Ego 4D. Once again, you can access this if you want. And it consists of the scans of the environment along with their labels, as well as the egocentric videos and the labels of the activities. And it's the typical thing that we see, this long tail distribution. So there's lots of examples of certain things, and then much less examples. And so one of the findings from this work is that there's lots of ways to organize the data in terms of the egocentric processing, the video processing, and in terms of the environment modeling. Here, what we're comparing is simply the same fixed video backbone, and then just comparing different standard ways to organize the environment model. So object-based representation, a kind of a surface-based representation, some different voxel-based representations. And it turns out that this particular voxel-based thing we're doing works the best. And the gap is pretty significant. So I think there's something about the way this data is being organized that has real predictive value. But there's lots of spatial representations that are out there, for use with deep models. So there's plenty of room to try other representations in this space. And just as an aside, like if you wanted to improve this, so one of the things that is going on is like, in principle, an object thing is better because the objects are well-defined spatially, so you can like organize the information in a fine-grained way. The critique of a voxel-based thing classically would be, well, you just got to decide how big the voxels are, and I mean, you can do hierarchical like we do, but there's still these hard boundaries. And then those sort of land in the scene in arbitrary places. There might be a voxel that has a corner of a table and part of a chair. And maybe it's useful to know that they're together, but maybe it's confusing that they're mixed together. It's not clear, right? So there's, kind of typical outcome of using a voxel-based representation. You might imagine an object-centered way of doing it might be better, but in the experiment we tried, it didn't work nearly as well. So that probably means there's scope to improve the object-based thing. I actually think you should be able to make it work, just as well, maybe better, but that's still like TBD. So there's plenty of work to do here. Right. And so then this is just comparing in the most important test setting, which is, so that previous example was just on validation stats, just to do kind of a comparison of representations. And now we're doing this for unseen environments. This is now where you have the space that we collected data in was very large with different sections. And so this is where you build a model in one section, and then you test it in another section where you've got overlap in the actions, but totally different spaces in which the actions were performed. And so that's a kind of a true generalization, because now you're testing this in a part of the spatial environment that's completely new to you. Okay, so the model has to generalize to the unseen environment in terms of the representation that's being developed. And there, the accuracy takes a big hit compared to before, and also the difference among the representations also is no longer nearly as significant. But I also think that we have a small data problem here. I think this is probably not, even though it's the biggest data set that's ever been collected for this problem, I don't think that it's probably big enough yet to really model this relationship accurately. So anyway, it's like, what is there at the end of every talk? It's a call for more data. So, that's just the world we live in right now. All right, let me wrap up. So this is just showing you some visualization of the particular activities and the context in which they were performed. There's nothing here that's super surprising. I'll just mention in passing one more piece of work, plug my student Miano's work a little bit more. So there's one last piece, which is not just the 3D scene, but the people in those scenes. Let's get those people as well. So this is some work on modeling people that you see in your environment, and was paired with some collaborators at ETH. And this is just some results. So now what you're doing is you're reconstructing the three-dimensional body model of the other person from the egocentric video. It's not working super great, but it's a pretty hard problem, and it's, I think, promising. So we'll get some more work on that going, and hopefully make that a lot better. All right, let me end by thanking my collaborators. So my collaborators at Georgia Tech, our collaborators in the autism space, Kathy Lord and Rebecca Jones, and then the Ego4D social team, helping us to make this large, massive data set. I want to thank all the sponsors, NIH, Early, and other organizations that funded this research. To conclude, if you want to understand social interactions, you should be egocentric. Okay, that's point number one. Egocentric is the key to understanding social interactions where they actually take place in the real world. Okay, in that setting, a key dimension of communication is the nonverbal communication, and we have the tools to study it. Okay, so you just have to work hard. Otherwise, we will totally solve this problem. If we do this, it will have substantial benefits for communities that need our help. Kids with autism all over the world that don't get diagnosed nearly early enough, and we do not have yet effective enough treatments for them, or the ability to deliver those treatments at scale. Solving that problem is going to take more than computer science, but computer science is a big part of solving that problem. And you can work on that today if you're interested. If you talk to me, I can get you lined up to work on that. Okay. And then one way you can get involved additionally is by using the Ego4D data set. It's a great data set. There's lots of papers to be written. I encourage you to write them and make sure to cite our paper, when you do that. In conclusion, this is the time, okay? And I think this place, like you guys, this is the group too, okay? So let's work on this. And again, seek me out. I'm really happy to get you connected to things that are going on. Okay, thank you.
My question is, how do you find the egocentric sign? How important do you think this egocentric thing is for like autonomous output staff relation?
Yeah.
Because I guess like tradition kind of like intuitive, you just put a camera and then you have this kind of egocentric view. But for language, it's a little bit unclear like how you're going to flash those kind of egocentric data.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, so the more you are talking about sensors, that can be grounded in the 3D world, the more important I would say the egocentric, modality or the approach is. So I would, argue that for perception, it's actually pretty important. And by perception, I mean vision, audition, tactile sensing, etc. Now, language is a different story, but I think in this group, there are many people that think that the right way to study language is in a grounded setting where you know things about the physical world in which language is being produced. So maybe there's no argument there. Or maybe there is, I don't know. Maybe the assistant professors all believe that and they have to persuade their peers that it's true. That's one possibility. So anyway, now how do you collect it? Well, with vision, it's sort of obvious and easy, mostly because we've done it. I mean, where we did it, it wasn't obvious maybe, but now it is. For audition, we're just beginning to get started. And so the way we did it in our Ego4D data set is we use these binaural microphones. So you tell the participants, just put this thing in your ear, okay? And then have fun with your friends. And it's okay. Like people wear for the music, they wear the earbuds or whatever. So it's not a big ask, I think, but they're a little bit uncomfortable. So that's only binaural though, which means only 2 microphones. What you really want is the array. And there's plenty of solutions for that, but they're not great in terms of like integrated into a commodity device that you can just give to people at their homes and they just wear it. And you're not in the sensor device building business, which having been in that business in the past, I really don't want to be in that business, like I want that to just exist. Yeah, so I think there are non-trivial challenges, and of course we're not measuring, touch at all. I mean, it can be measured, but that's even more cumbersome, how you do that. And then we're also not measuring anything else. So I think the measurement side, there's some room, to grow that. I don't think it's fundamentally limited by, let's say, scientific knowledge. It's more like engineering and platform. I think that'll get better over time. That's my belief. Kind of a long answer to your question. But. Yeah. Correct. Yeah, good question. So the question is, predicting the future hand mask, you should know what the person is trying to do, ideally. And then in the setting that we did this, it was people cooking at home. So it was pretty clear that there was a task and it was pretty well defined. The model does not have access to the task in this case. But you could make it available to the model. So that's an experiment we didn't do, but I wanted to do is if it knows that you're making an omelet, does it help? Not totally clear, but maybe. Yeah, that's right. So you could provide more information. But I mean, in a sense, we'd like to. So I guess what I would say is if we can do it without that stuff, it'd be good. I can just put a camera on your head and then predict where your hands are going and say, oh, that you're about to, you're using a power saw, like stop, like I think I know where your hands are going and you shouldn't go there, like that kind of thing. Like that's obviously like a motivating application. Like I'd like to do it just from the video, but maybe you can argue if you have those kind of labels at training time, maybe it helps the model in some way. So I think there's plenty of space, to do things there. So it's a good idea.